Hello again. As Black History Month gathers pace in Britain at this time of year, more and more is being said about slavery. The thesis, which seems to be swallowed by almost everybody, is that white people have ancestors who were slave owners, and that black people, on the other hand, are the descendants of those slaves. This has the effect of making many white people feel guilty about, well, being white, really. They need not be, for their ancestors are just as likely to include slaves as any black person one meets. Before I start, I'll mention that because there are always those who accuse me of telling lies or misleading people, I've included a list of references in the description to this video so that viewers may check for themselves what I'm saying. The first thing to remind ourselves of is that slavery has been practiced in all parts of the world for the whole of recorded history. Europe, Africa, Asia, North America, South America all have a history of slavery. Let's see what's happened in the British Isles. The first recorded facts about Britain are to be found in the writings of Romans and Greeks, including Julius Caesar. Writing in about 10 AD, the Greek geographer Strabo said of Britain, "It bears grain, cattle, gold, silver and iron. These things accordingly are exported from the island, as also are hides, slaves and dogs that are by nature suited for hunting." There's archaeological evidence to back this up. In 1942, a slave chain dating from the Iron Age was dredged from the lake of Llyncerrig on the Isle of Anglesey. It was designed to link 5 slaves together by metal hoops around their necks. In other words, before the Romans even arrived in this country, slavery and the slave trade existed. When the Romans colonised Britain from 43 AD onward, they enslaved many of the people. Some they exported to Europe, others were simply kept as slaves in this country. Roman slave chains have been found in Hampshire, for example. This was once common knowledge in Britain. Indeed, English identity itself is closely bound up with the slave trade at that time. In the late 6th century, Pope Gregory was passing the slave market in Rome when he saw some beautiful children for sale. He inquired about them and was told that they were Angles from Britain, or Angli. He then made a clever pun in Latin saying, "Non Angli sed Angeli." Not Angles, but angels. Writing about this story, the Venerable Bede, the Anglo-Saxon historian, first began describing the people living in the country as English after telling that anecdote. The idea that the English constituted a separate and distinct nation dates from this time, and English identity began as a result of what was seen in that slave market in Rome. Irish identity too is bound up with the slave trade. Slavers were quite keen on raiding Britain at that time. St. Patrick was of course British, and in the 5th century he was captured from the coast of either England or Wales by slavers from Ireland and carried off to that country at the age of 16. He is of course now the patron saint of Ireland. Ireland's other patron saint, St. Bridget of Kildare, was the daughter of a slave. Once the Romans left Britain, the Angles, Saxons and Jutes from what is now Germany and Denmark arrived, and they made slaves of many people. They were in turn captured and enslaved by raiders from Scandinavia, the people we know as Vikings. The Vikings established many bases for their slave trading activities. The cities of Dublin, Limerick and Waterford were all founded as Viking centres for slavery. The Vikings would capture slaves in England and Wales and then take them by ship to Dublin, from where they would be sold on for export to Africa or Scandinavia. Of course, once the Vikings occupied half of England, that part of the country to the northeast, we call it the Danelaw, they kept many slaves there themselves to work the land. Bristol was a major centre for the slave trade at that time, and there were auctions there of slaves. This continued until the Norman conquest in 1066. Writing in the early 11th century, a priest described the scene at Bristol. You could see and sigh over rows of wretches bound together with ropes, young people of both sexes whose beautiful appearance and youthful innocence might move barbarians to pity, daily exposed to prostitution, daily offered for sale. Yes, that's the same Bristol where there was all that fuss about the statue of a slaver last summer during the Black Lives Matter business. Do you think any of those taking part realised that white people's ancestors had been sold as slaves in the city centuries before the transatlantic slave trade began? The trade in slaves was extensive, and there were an awful lot of slaves in Britain before the Normans arrived. The practice was fading somewhat by that time, but according to the Domesday Book, as late as 1086, 10% of the English population were slaves. Almost any white person in England is likely to have an ancestor who was a slave. To pretend, as so many people do, that slavery is a special misfortune which only befell black people is really not sensible. Just as we in Britain have forgotten about our own experiences in this way hundreds of years ago, so it is time for the Africans and Caribbeans living in the country to drop the idea that what happened to their distant ancestors has any particular relevance or even interest in the modern world.